Greetings and salutations. Today's video will be about my interpretations of the foot, what it does during gait, and how it relates to the polyarticular chains as defined by the Postural Restoration Institute. I'm going to start by talking about the two primary actions available at the foot, pronation and supination. Supination is involved during the loading of the foot and therefore the entire body. This movement is defined as the combination of adduction of the forefoot, inversion of the subtalar joint, and plantar flexion at the talocrural joint. Let's take a look at what the hell all that actually means. So, adduction of the forefoot. I don't fucking like that term. Not because I think it's wrong, but because it's a little misleading. For effective supination, the first ray needs anterior rotation or flexion. My first ray includes, oh, there you go. There you go. All right, cool. All right, first ray includes all these guys. Right, so they would be flexing. It doesn't actually adduct until the mid-tarsal joint inverts. Mid-tarsal joint would be this joint right here. I understand I'm pointing across two different joints, but the talus and the calcaneus, their motions are coupled, just as the navicular and the cuboid, their motions are coupled, right? So, you know, it's really functionally one joint right here. Anyways, right, the first ray, it doesn't adduct until the mid-tarsal joint inverts, changing the position of the navicular right here. So if we're to analyze the forefoot by itself for a second, it is simply anteriorly rotating, right? So picture for a second, this foot is pronating, right? So actually abductor hallucis is quite helpful for that. So imagine this thing is pronated, so the medial arch is dropped onto the floor. When you supinate to raise this in a successful supination, this will be burying itself into the ground to establish leverage for the medial arch to raise. So there is just, for the most part, systemic flexion going on here. So this coupled with the relative extension or posterior rotation at the lateral raise, the forefoot is simply everting. Now, just to be clear, the fourth and fifth ray, they aren't actually extending. The first ray just has a whole lot more flexion going on. So in relative terms, these guys are extending, passive extension, if you will. Now, moving on up, the talonavicular joint. So meaning talus right here, right? This weird ass thing right here, navicular here. So this is the medial half of the not subtalar joint, the mid-tarsal joint, right? So this is the most mobile joint of the foot, and it is the seat of the attachments, many of the attachments, of the tibialis posterior muscle. Arguably the most important mover of the foot and ankle because it is the primary supinator. Now let's take a look at this massive ass muscle, right? So taking a look at the attachments of the posterior tib, it's easy to see its influence over supination, right? All these attachments, you know, navicular, cuneiform, all the other tarsals, except for cuboid. So, damn program. Okay, cool. Right there. Right. So as this thing pulls back, because you know, like it can planar flex this muscle, but at the level of the foot, it is a relatively linear posterior superior pull. Right. So when that happens, all these guys, they're gonna go into anterior rotation. Right? So when that happens, the medial arch is going to raise because this will obviously be hitting the ground, right? as it hits the ground, this becomes a pretty good paddle, right, to leverage the medial arch to come up. As it comes up, it will lock the whole foot into supination. Now, the subtalar joint. This is one interesting structure. Hold on, let me get this in there. All right, cool, right there. Subtalar joint, calcaneus right here, and the rest of the foot over here, right? And this is the top of the foot, so you got tibia here, you got fibula here, right? This is one interesting joint because neither of these muscles have major muscular, did I just say that? Neither of these bones have major muscular attachments on themselves. In particular, the talus, nothing connects to it except for ligaments and capsule, right? So therefore, their actions follow their neighbors. In this case, would be the forefoot, right, and the metatarsal joints. Now let's take a look at the shape of the navicular. All right, cool. So I'm just gonna select the whole foot. All right, cool. So, boom. Now, navicular, they thought this thing looked like a boat, so that's why they call it navicular, navicular, right? Interestingly, so when the foot is fully supinated, this medial portion of the navicular that is more curved, it cups the head of the talus and keeps it under control, right? And this control is one of the things that makes supination such a effective locking mechanism for the entire foot. So when the medial portion of the navicular cups the head of the talus into a supinated position, the head of the talus moves superiorly and laterally, right? Can it make sense? Locking the foot. Now, when this happens, let me get out. When this happens, this muscle right here, the abductor hallucis, helps and assists in the entire supination process by bringing the first MTP, the metatarsal phalangeal joint, towards the calcaneus, and in turn the calcaneus towards the first MTP, forming a closed kinetic circuit consisting of a raising medial arch, anteriorly rotating first ray, and inverting mid-tarsal joint, and locking, well, also inverting subtalar joints. Now, I want to take a moment and talk about the kinetic implications of all of this. With the medial arch raising, right, with the medial arch raising itself, the foot is now successfully controlling and raising its own center of mass. Now, when I say its own center of mass, I'm just talking about the foot, right? So in this supinated position that the computer model has is showing right now, I would wager the center of mass probably somewhere around here in terms of the transverse plane, and in frontal plane it's probably more to the medial side than the lateral side, obviously. So it's successfully controlling its own. God damn it. Okay, cool. It's successfully in controlling its own center of mass. In other words, it can now be actively involved in the management of the entire body's center of mass. In other words, pronation is what happens when we either fail in anti-gravitational activities, or the task of center of mass control is being transitioned to another structure, in this case, another foot. Right? Now, moving on up the chain, as the foot successfully supinates, the top of the talus moves laterally and posteriorly, right? So, right, top of the talus, this guy, right? You know, imagine this thing being in a pronated position, so the medial arch drops. The talus is going to drop off this little shelf here, right? I mean, it's not going to completely fall off, but it's going to partially fall off. as it does that, it's going to move medially, and because the navicular opens, the talar head is going to go with it to some degree, right? So you're going to move medially and anteriorly. Therefore, when you supinate and you go from a collapsed position to the current position being presented by the computer model, you're going to move, or this is going to move laterally and posteriorly. So when this happens, obviously it will also externally rotate the tibia that sits on top of this thing. This external rotation is crucial for hip loading because of what it does to the musculature around the knee, as well as its contribution to the screw hole mechanic of the knee. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about what the screw hole mechanic is. Google that shit. It's pretty simple. Now, looking at the fiber orientation of the quad, let me bring all that shit online. All right, cool. All right, cool. Now, looking at the fiber orientation of the quads, it's not hard to see that it exerts a external rotation moment on the tibia. However, a tibia externally rotating from the foot's supination would inhibit the quads because it would shorten the quads. At the same time, it will load things like medial hamstrings and some of the smaller adductors, because look at the twisting fiber orientation of these guys onto their tibial attachments, right? So if the tibia was to externally rotate itself, it would lengthen these guys, kicking on tonic stretch reflex in these muscles, and in turn shortening them, or at least activate them. Now, speaking of the knee, I want to take a more of a bird's eye view of things for a second. Now, consider the sustentaculum tali, which is this shelf right here, right? Sustentaculum is apparently the Latin name for shelf. So there's no shit, just shelf for the talus. Considering this guy and how when, as the medial talus sits on top of it, during supination, this shelf is raising the medial talus up, right? I guess you can't raise something down, but anyways, in turn, it's providing ascending support for the medial tibia, right? I mean, the entire tibia is going up, but there's much more concentrated ascending forces going through the medial tibia, right? This, in turn, provides ascending support for the medial femoral condyle, facilitating the optimal centration for the obligatory transverse plane activity at the knee. Yeah, that's right. I said transverse plane at the knee. The knee is not a hinge joint, unlike what a lot of us have been taught in school. Let's take a look at the architectural features at the knee. Okay. Give me a second, people. Enjoy this portion of the video while I struggle against technology. Oh. Okay, cool. Okay, all right, we got this, got this, got this. All right, cool. Hopefully this works. Boom, there you go. All right, cool. Now, the femoral condyles. It's not hard to see here that your medial condyle protrudes much further down than your lateral condyle. To complement that, at the tibia, the medial tibial plateau is much deeper than the lateral one. All right, don't fail me now, computer. Okay, there you go, there you go, there you go. Okay, cool, right? There's some depth here, don't get me wrong, there's absolutely some depth here, but this guy, much deeper, right? It is much deeper. So, one more thing. Okay, now this is a much better view of things, right? So, right, look at how much deeper the medial plateau is with the meniscus, right? The lateral one, you know, it's not shallow, but it ain't deep like this one, okay? So, as a result, the pivot point of transverse plane motion of the knee crosses the anterior portion. Let me get back in there. It crosses the anterior portion of the medial plateau and the medial femoral condyle. Now, putting all this stuff together, this means when we go into mid-stance of gait, meaning from heel strike into mid-stance, our stance foot and knee work together to provide leverage for the stance hip to pull our torso over that side. So for those of you who have taken impingement and instability with PRI, you will know then on the right leg, this is what the brain prefers it to do. Meaning the brain, the normal, natural human brain who is stuck in or prefers left AIC pattern, prefers the right leg to be the loading leg, or right side, excuse me, the right side to be the loading side, right? In other words, the right foot prefers supination, whereas the left foot prefers pronation. As the left side is the unloading side, right? So from a intervention strategy perspective, that also means it's the left side that needs a foot that can supinate, just as a left hip needs to be able to internal rotate, adduct, and compress. Right? Okay, so as always, feel free to shoot any questions you have within the comments of this video, and I will see you guys next time I think of something useful. Have a nice day.